bitter February night in 1841, 17-year-old Eliza Monroe was forced through a howling Mississippi blizzard toward the plantation's icehouse. Her master, Harrison Bellamy, meant to lock her inside as punishment for what he called uppity behavior. But when the heavy wooden door slammed shut, it wasn't Eliza who was sealed in that frozen chamber. By dawn, the Bellamy family lay lifeless inside their own icehouse, while Eliza vanished into the storm. The only trace she left behind was a rusty key dangling from the latch, fueling whispers of the ice witch of Natchez that haunted the region for generations. The Bellamy plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of Mississippi Delta land, its grand white house a monument to wealth built on misery. Harrison had inherited both the estate and 200 enslaved people from his grandfather, along with a reputation for cruelty so severe it unsettled even his peers. His wife, Catherine, frail in body but sharp in tongue, wielded her words like knives. Their children followed in their footsteps, absorbing their parents' casual brutality. 12-year-old Robert reveled in disciplining slaves with inventive punishments, while 10-year-old twins, Margaret and Michael, competed in tormenting the house servants, treating human lives as little more than toys for their amusement. Eliza had been born into this world of suffering during a harsh winter. Her mother died giving birth, and her father toiled under the overseer's lash until death took him too. She grew up under the care of Sarah, the plantation cook, who became mother to countless orphans left behind by the cruelty of the system. Sarah secretly taught Eliza to read with scraps of newspapers, a dangerous skill that could cost a slave fingers or even life if discovered. Yet Eliza's hunger for knowledge pushed her to memorize conversations, letters, and documents she glimpsed while working. By 15, she had been moved from the fields into the main house, where she witnessed firsthand the Bellamy's cruelty. Harrison's drunken rages, Catherine's vicious words, and the children's twisted games. To them, Eliza was not a girl, but property, something to use and discard. That winter came earlier and harsher than most, locking the Mississippi in ice and cutting off towns for weeks. The plantation's ice house, carved deep into a hill, was more vital than ever, stocked with river ice to preserve food. Eliza was assigned to work there as punishment after Catherine claimed she was insolent. In truth, her only offense was failing to hide her disgust when young Robert tortured a kitten for amusement. The punishment was brutal. Day after day, Eliza labored in that bone-chilling vault, arranging supplies while her thin dress and worn shoes offered no shield against the killing cold. Breath turned to mist, fingers numbed to uselessness, and still she endured. What happened next would turn the Bellamy name to a legend of horror and leave behind a mystery that Mississippi would whisper about for decades. The ice house, though bitterly cold, gave Eliza something she had never known in 17 years of bondage solitude. Away from the eyes and cruelty of the Bellamy household, she finally had moments to think, to imagine, and to plan. In that frozen chamber, she began hiding small objects in cracks and corners, quietly building a cache of supplies she might one day use if the chance to escape ever came. But her secret refuge was never truly safe. Harrison Bellamy liked to stalk the ice house unannounced, circling her like a hunter while she worked, finding fault in everything she touched. His breath reeked of whiskey, his gray eyes sharp with menace, and too often his inspections turned into violations that left Eliza shaken and powerless. His threats were whispered in her ear, promises of the pain awaiting slave girls who dared to resist. Catherine's cruelty came in a different form, calculated, precise, and designed to erode Eliza's spirit. She would send her to the ice house on the coldest days, ensuring she returned with lips blue from frost, Nellie, to smile sweetly and remark how the chill brought out her color as if frostbite were a pretty blush. The Bellamy children joined in their parents' sadism. Robert, already mimicking his father's violence, once slammed Eliza into a wall hard enough to leave her bruised for weeks. The twins. Margaret and Michael preferred psychological games, whispering gruesome tales of runaway slaves, hunted down reveling in Eliza's discomfort. As the winter deepened, Eliza began to notice the small cracks forming in the family's armor. Harrison's drinking had grown worse, his nights ending in staggering stupors. Catherine dosed herself more heavily with laudanum, her sharp words sometimes slurred into incoherence. And for all their cruelty, the children were still young enough to fear the unknown, their bravado faltering when things slipped beyond their control. Then on February 14th, 1841, the storm arrived. The worst blizzard anyone could remember tore across the Mississippi Delta, winds screaming through the trees, while temperatures plunged 20 degrees below zero. The plantation was smothered in a white silence, cut off completely from the outside world. That evening, the Bellamys gathered in the parlor firelight, flickering across their faces as they discussed the future. Wealthy relatives from New Orleans were set to visit investors whose money could secure the plantation's expansion. Everything needed to appear perfect, landhouse and slaves alike. Eliza moved quietly among them, serving cleaning preparing rooms for guests while the storm hammered the walls. But as she passed unseen, she overheard Harrison and Catherine talking about her. To them, her careful obedience looked like defiance. They claimed she was growing bold, too bold, and agreed that she needed to be broken once and for all. The punishment they plotted that night was not meant simply to remind Eliza of her place. It was meant to destroy her body and her will together. They meant for that night to be Eliza's end. Stripped of her shawl and shoes, locked barefoot in the icehouse, with nothing but a thin dress, she was expected to shiver herself into death before dawn. Catherine's refinements made the punishment more cruel. Robert and the twins delighted in the spectacle, and Harrison carried it out with the smug certainty of a man who believed he owned both her body and her fate. But Eliza had spent months in that chamber, memorizing every stone and draft, every pocket of air and trick of circulation. She understood the Icehouse in a way the Bellamys never could. If they wanted to turn it into her tomb, she would turn it into theirs. At the height of the blizzard, the family trudged through knee-deep snow with their lanterns flickering against the icy wind. The air inside the Icehouse was worse than the storm itself. A dead chill that swallowed sound and warmth, making the chamber feel like a crypt. Harrison shoved Eliza to the center, explaining with relish how she would spend the night here learning gratitude for the warmth of the main house, or else freezing to death, easily replaced at the next Natchez slave market. Catherine snatched away the last shred of comfort she had, and the children's eyes gleamed with a thrill of cruelty, already imagining the story they would brag about to their friends. As Harrison moved to close the door, Eliza finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady, asking if they thought it safe to walk back through the worsening storm, pointing out how the temperature seemed to be dropping even lower. Harrison faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the question. Catherine barked out a laugh, reminding Eliza that they had warm clothes and a heated house awaiting them, luxuries she would never know again. The children added their own cruel words about the difference between masters and slaves. Eliza listened, nodded, as if she understood, and then moved with sudden, decisive speed. She darted to the entrance, and before they could even register her intent, swung the heavy door closed from the outside. The lock snapped into place. The Bellamys were sealed inside the frozen vault they had prepared for her, their lantern light flickering against the ice as Eliza disappeared into the screaming blizzard. That night, the balance of power shifted forever. The Bellamys would never leave their tomb, and Eliza became something more than a runaway slave. She became the whispered legend of the Ice Witch of Natchez. The iron key turned in the lock with a deafening clang, and for a moment there was only stunned silence before the reality set in. Harrison's furious roar echoed off the frozen stone as he hurled his body against the door, demanding that Eliza return, unlock it, and accept whatever punishment he decided for her rebellion. Catherine's voice joined his, slipping between venom and false sweetness, promising torture one moment and mercy the next, if only she would submit. But Eliza did not turn back. Wrapped in a stolen winter coat and carrying the small cache of supplies she had hidden away for months, she was already walking toward the main house with steady, deliberate steps. Inside, the great rooms that had once been stages for cruelty now stood silent, except for the faint crackle of the storm against the windows. Eliza moved like a shadow through the halls, gathering what she needed. From Harrison's study, she took gold coins and banknotes to finance her escape. From Catherine's chambers, she claimed heavy boots and warm clothing. In the children's room, she collected small trinkets that could be traded for shelter or food. Her most daring act came in the record room. By candlelight, she opened the ledgers where Harrison kept meticulous notes of every asset he owned, land tools, and human lives. With the secret literacy Sarah had given her, Eliza altered entries to shift her legal status from enslaved to free, forging the papers that might one day mean the difference between capture and survival. All the while, faint cries drifted from the direction of the Icehouse, weakening with each hour as the cold stole the Bellamy's strength. Eliza felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only a calm certainty that justice had played its hand. They had chosen the Icehouse as her grave. She had turned it into theirs. Before dawn, she entered the stables where the warm breath of horses hung in the frigid air. She chose Lightning, a strong mare she had tended many times, who greeted her with quiet trust. The animal accepted her, as if knowing instinctively that this night marked a turning point, as the first light of morning spread across the frozen delta painting. The world in red and gold, Eliza mounted Lightning and rode away. Behind her, smoke curled from the chimneys of the slave quarters, where the other bondspeople rose to another day of labor, still unaware their masters would never wake again. Ahead stretched the road to Natchez, a path she had traced countless times in her mind while studying maps and overhearing her master's dealings. She knew the routes that led toward free soil, where no one could claim her body or her name. The snow crunched beneath Lightning's hooves, each step carrying her farther from bondage and closer to a future she would shape for herself. For the first time in her life, Eliza Monroe was not someone else's property. She was her own. By midday, Eliza had already pushed more than 30 miles behind her guiding Lightning along back roads that kept her hidden from watchful eyes. Every so often, she stopped to rest the mare, her hands lingering over the forged papers she had crafted with such care. They named her Elizabeth Washington, a freed woman from New Orleans, traveling north to join family in St. Louis. The handwriting mirrored Harrison's style with uncanny accuracy, and the seals she had copied lent an air of legitimacy strong enough to deflect casual suspicion. As dusk settled across the frozen countryside, Eliza searched for a safe place to spend the night. She found it in a weathered cabin tucked off the road, its roof still sound and its chimney waiting for fire. Inside, she struck a flame with matches from her cache and fed it with broken furniture until the small blaze pushed back the cold. The warmth was almost shocking after the endless chill of the Icehouse, and she let herself imagine a future where warmth was not rationed as a master's gift, but something she could claim as her own. From her stolen stores, she prepared a meal: fresh bread, spiced meat, creamy cheese. These were flavors once forbidden, now savored slowly, each bite proof she was no longer bound by anyone's table scraps. Yet even in this victory, her mind returned to the family locked in their frozen tomb. Did they still live shivering in darkness, or had the storm finished what she began? Part of her wanted them to linger in suffering long enough to understand her act to feel the helplessness they had forced on others. But another part, quieter and harder, wished them gone from the world entirely. That night, sleep came only in broken pieces, haunted by dreams of voices echoing in the ice. By dawn, frost glazed the cabin windows, a reminder that winter still held its grip. Eliza saddled Lightning once more and pressed on toward Natchez, her path blocked by fallen trees, ice-slick roads, and the wreckage left by the blizzard. But the mare carried her carefully forward, each step a measured stride away from bondage. On the second day, she reached the city's edge where Natchez stretched along the Mississippi like a living artery, bustling with steamboats, merchants, and travelers from every corner of the valley. The sight filled her with equal measures of hope and dread. Here, freedom could be purchased in the form of a riverboat ticket or lost forever with a single misstep. She knew the city's geography from maps studied in secret, the docks, the hotels, the horse traders, the shipping offices. Her plan was simple: sell Lightning for enough coin, buy passage north, and pass her forged papers with confidence. But as she drew closer, her heart tightened with a new realization. Lightning was no ordinary horse. Sleek, powerful, and well-known she was, Harrison Bellamy's pride recognized across the county. Anyone who saw a young black woman leading that distinctive mare into town would begin asking questions, and in Natchez, questions like that could mean death. The answer to her dilemma came almost by chance when she spotted a small livery stable at the edge of Natchez. Its weathered sign promised fair prices, and the man tending the yard, a broad-shouldered fellow with work-hardened hands and steady eyes, looked up as she rode in. Surprise flickered across his face at the sight of such a fine animal beneath a young black woman. But he spoke with polite respect as he asked what she needed. Eliza dismounted, steadying her voice as she told the story she had practiced along the road. She was Elizabeth Washington, a freedwoman traveling north, and Lightning had been given to her as payment for years of loyal service. Now she needed to turn the mare into cash to continue her journey. The man studied Lightning with the practiced calm of someone who knew horses better than people. He ran his hands along her legs, checked her teeth, and appraised her condition. His verdict was clear. The animal was extraordinary, easily worth $200. But he also knew such a distinctive horse could raise questions. Selling her openly would be dangerous. For a moment, Eliza feared this careful honesty would trap her in Natchez longer than she dared risk. Yet instead of refusing, the stable owner offered her a lifeline. He had a discreet buyer upriver looking for just such a horse. The deal could be made quickly without fuss, and he was willing to pay $180. It was less than the full value, but more wealth than Eliza had ever touched in her life. Within hours, the transaction was complete. Gold coins clinked into her pouch, their weight a tangible promise of freedom. The stableman asked no questions he didn't need answered, treating her as any other customer. With relief surging in her chest, Eliza turned toward the waterfront, her steps lighter now, though the bag on her shoulder was heavier than ever. The Natchez riverfront was alive with motion steamboats hissing at their docks, wagons creaking with cotton bales. Voices rising in a dozen accents as travelers, merchants, and deckhands hurried about their business. Eliza scanned the vessels carefully. She needed a boat that was sturdy and respectable, but not so grand as to invite scrutiny. Her eyes settled on the River Belle, a mid-sized paddle steamer bound for St. Louis the next morning. It looked well kept, without being ostentatious, a ship where a passenger like her might pass without notice. At the ticket office, the clerk gave her forged documents a brisk inspection. The name, Elizabeth Washington, the free woman from New Orleans with family in Missouri, matched the careful script she had imitated. The seals looked genuine enough for his quick glance, and what mattered most to him was her ability to pay. Eliza drew coins from her pouch with a steady hand, and the sound of hard money silenced whatever doubts lingered. Few enslaved people ever carried such sums, and her calm confidence carried the rest. That evening she found a modest boarding house near the docks. The room was small but clean, the bed soft, the linens fresh. To Eliza, it was a luxury beyond imagining. She lay down, and for the first time in her life, drifted to sleep without fear of footsteps in the dark. At dawn, the air was alive with steam whistles and shouted orders. The river bell readied to cast off its decks, filling with passengers and crew. Eliza joined the flow of travelers boarding the boat. Her travel bag clutched close, her forged papers ready, and her heart steady with a quiet rising certainty. For the first time, she was no longer running from chains. She was sailing toward freedom. The crew of the River Bell treated Eliza with the same professional politeness given to any paying passenger, showing her to the modest second-class quarters she had purchased. When the boat's whistle blew and the paddle wheels churned against the muddy current, she stood at the rail and watched Natchez shrink into the distance. Every turn of the wheel carried her farther from the Bellamy family's frozen tomb and closer to lands where the law no longer defined her as property. The days on the river passed in cautious silence. Eliza kept to herself, her forged identity never slipping, as she answered only when necessary. She spent long hours gazing at the shifting banks of the Mississippi, where plantations, river towns, and lonely farmhouses dotted the horizon like beads strung along the water's edge. Around her, merchants, families, and laborers traveled north in search of new fortunes and fresh starts. To most, she was invisible, a quiet young woman on her way to relatives hardly worth a second glance. But on the fourth day, her fragile calm nearly shattered. Two plantation owners in the dining saloon were trading news from Natchez. They said the Bellamy family had been discovered dead in their icehouse, frozen during the blizzard in what officials called a tragic accident. Their tone shifted when they mentioned a missing slave girl from the estate last seen the very night of the family's death. A reward had been posted large enough to tempt slave catchers from miles around. Hunters, they warned, were already scouring the countryside for her trail. Eliza forced her face into a mask of disinterest, her hands steady as she lifted a cup to her lips. Inside, her pulse hammered with fear. She knew bounty hunters were clever, ruthless, and relentless. Forged papers and new clothes might fool a casual clerk, but trained pursuers would see through the disguise if they ever caught up. On the fifth day, the River Bell pulled into St. Louis under a gray March sky, smoke from chimneys and steam stacks mingling into a haze that hung over the booming riverfront. Compared to Natchez, the city was a giant, a bustling port, where German immigrants, free black families, and working people of every stripe hurried through streets lined with shops, taverns, and warehouses. Disembarking with the crowd, Eliza walked with steady confidence, her forged documents tucked safely away, her pouch of coins still heavy enough to start over. Within days, she secured work at a German woman's dressmaking shop. Mrs. Richter, the owner, needed skilled hands to keep up with demand from St. Louis's growing middle class. Eliza's evenings in the plantation sewing room had honed her craft, and she quickly proved her worth at the cutting table and the needle. The wages, though modest, were steady enough to rent a small room in a respectable boarding house and begin saving toward the day. She might push farther north into states where slavery had no hold at all. Her co-workers, immigrant women from Germany and Ireland, treated her as one of their own, just another young woman trying to carve out a living. For a time, she allowed herself to believe she had left the past behind. Yet Missouri was still slave territory, and bounty hunters prowled its cities with keen eyes and sharper instincts. The newspapers carried regular reward notices for escaped slaves, the descriptions printed in brutal detail. 3 months after her arrival, Eliza unfolded a sheet fresh off the press and felt her blood run cold. The notice offered a large sum for the return of a runaway girl, 17 years old, about 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a scar on her left wrist from a childhood injury. The description was unmistakably hers. The Bellamy's legacy and the price on her freedom had followed her upriver. The reward notice changed everything. What had once been a desperate flight for freedom now became a manhunt for a supposed murderer. $700 was a fortune in 1841, more than enough to lure every professional slave hunter from Missouri to Kentucky. And the notice carried the weight of the Bellamy family's surviving relatives. They rejected the official story of an accident, insisting instead that the deaths were deliberate, that their missing servant had turned killer. To the public, Eliza was no longer just a runaway. She was a fugitive accused of slaughtering her masters, including children. Even abolitionists, who often risked everything to aid escaped slaves, might hesitate now. Sympathy was harder to find when the newspapers painted her as a child murderer, regardless of the truth. Eliza understood she could not stay in St. Louis. That night she spread out maps and timetables in her small room, calculating the coins in her pouch against the distance she needed to travel. Canada beckoned like a promise, its soil governed by British law, where American slave catchers had no authority. She knew she must vanish northward before hunters closed in. Help came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Richter, the German shopkeeper who had employed Eliza in her dressmaking shop, had noticed her increasing anxiety. She had seen the signs before others had passed through her care, running from something they dared not name. Quietly, she approached Eliza with an offer. Arrangements could be made. A family of German immigrants preparing to move to Wisconsin Territory would accept her as their household servant, traveling under their papers and their protection. Together, they would cross Illinois, where free soil laws gave her better cover, and continue north into lands where slavery had never taken root. A week later, Eliza joined the wagon train. 15 families moved together, their wagons heavy with livestock, farm tools, and hopes of prosperity. For them, the journey was a quest for land and opportunity. For Eliza, walking beside their oxen and tending their children, it was the final leg of her escape. Each mile north felt lighter, as though the iron weight of bondage and fear was slowly lifting from her shoulders. Wisconsin in 1841 was a frontier of endless forest and fertile prairie, a place where immigrants built cabins and barns from raw timber carving farms out of wilderness. The German family that sheltered her purchased land near the growing settlement of Milwaukee, and Eliza worked beside them through their first hard season, blending seamlessly into their household. When their roots were secure, she struck out on her own. In Milwaukee, Eliza discovered a city of possibility. Free black men and women worked as laborers, craftsmen, even business owners. German and Yankee families created a thriving market for skilled seamstresses. Eliza found work with a local tailor, her nimble hands and precise eye quickly earning respect. Word spread of her talent and her quiet professionalism, and within a year, she had saved enough to rent her own small house. There she opened her own dressmaking business, welcoming clients who valued both the beauty of her work and her silence about the private details she overheard. For the first time in her life, Eliza Monroe lived not as property nor as prey, but as a free woman building her own place in the world. The shadow of Natchez still lingered, whispered in the stories of the ice witch told along the Mississippi. Yet in Milwaukee, she was no legend. She was simply a woman with a needle and thread, determined to stitch together the life she had always deserved. Eliza's years in Milwaukee brought comfort she had never imagined possible. Her dressmaking business flourished, giving her steady income and a respected place in the community. She rented her own house, furnished it with care, and contributed to the Methodist Church where many black families worshipped. Yet with prosperity came new dangers. The more visible she became, the greater the risk that bounty hunters might recognize her and claim the still substantial reward for her capture. When Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, Eliza's life was once again shadowed by fear. The law required not only federal officers, but but ordinary citizens, to aid in capturing escaped slaves, even in states that had outlawed slavery. Milwaukee's black community responded by creating a secret network of warning signals and safe houses. Eliza gave financial support to the effort, but kept herself at arm's length, knowing her notoriety made her more dangerous to protect than most. The Civil War brought a new kind of hope. From its outbreak in 1861, Eliza followed every development, attending church meetings, where black leaders debated what the conflict meant for their future. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, she joined in the citywide celebrations, the joy of that night reminding her that her long-ago gamble for freedom had been part of a much larger struggle. The proclamation did not directly affect her status, but it pointed toward a nation where slavery would no longer define millions of lives. 2 years later, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery outright, stripping away the legal foundation of the bounty that had once hung over her head. For the first time since she slammed that Icehouse door shut, Eliza could call herself truly free. Freedom, however, did not erase the past. As the South stumbled through Reconstruction, Eliza felt a growing pull to return to Mississippi, not as property or fugitive, but as a free woman seeking closure. In 1868, at 44 years old, she boarded a train and made the 3-day journey back to Natchez. The familiar landscapes stirred memories of her desperate escape nearly 3 decades earlier, when each mile had been measured in terror and stolen breaths. Natchez itself had changed. The war and the end of slavery had broken its economy. The grand mansions still stood on the bluffs, but many showed cracked columns, sagging roofs, and a faded glory their owners could no longer afford to maintain. From the city, she hired a carriage and rode the 25 miles out to what remained of the Bellamy plantation. The fields where cotton once stretched in endless rows were now swallowed by young forest. The slave quarters were gone, reduced to stone foundations and weeds. The main house still stood, but boarded windows and vines clinging to the walls gave it the look of a mausoleum. One building, however, remained intact, the Icehouse. Its thick stone walls had resisted time and weather. The heavy wooden door still solid, and the air inside still carrying a memory of frozen silence. Eliza stood before it, remembering the bitter cold that had nearly ended her life. The voices calling her name as the Bellamys realized too late that their power had turned against them. She stepped inside. The shelves were bare now. The ice long melted, but the chamber felt unchanged. The heavy stillness pressed in on her, the air sharp with remembered cruelty. She searched herself for regret, especially for the children who had died so young. But what she found was something closer to vindication. They had been raised in cruelty, and they had met an end of their own making. She did not celebrate it, but neither did she mourn. The Icehouse had been their weapon, and she had simply reversed its purpose. As the sun sank, Eliza walked the plantation grounds one last time. She touched the cracked stone columns of the great house, looked out over the fields, where enslaved men and women had labored, and let the memories rise and pass. What had once been a place of pain and terror was now only a ruin. She left it behind with steady steps, carrying with her not guilt, but the hard-won knowledge of how far she had come, from a girl stripped of freedom to a woman who had claimed it for herself. The train that carried Eliza north rolled past fields and towns reshaped by war and freedom. Where once enslaved hands had bent under whips, she now saw black families working their own land, children filing into schools that would have been unthinkable in her youth, and new churches rising as centers of community and independence. Freed men and women now spoke in town halls and voted in elections, living proof that a world once unimaginable was slowly being born. Back in Milwaukee, Eliza returned to a life that finally carried peace. The nightmares that had long stalked her sleep faded, replaced with dreams not of the past, but of the future. She expanded her shop hired assistants and invested her savings wisely. With time, she purchased the building that housed her business, converting the upper floors into apartments for working women. It became more than a shop, it was a haven, a place where women supported one another in the challenges of city life. The ownership of that property stood as a physical symbol of everything Eliza had seized for herself through will, intellect, and courage. Over the years, she became a quiet legend within Milwaukee's Black community. Few knew the full story of how she had gained her freedom or what had happened in Mississippi on that fateful winter night. To most, she was simply Elizabeth Washington, a skilled seamstress and respected businesswoman. She mentored dozens of young women, offering jobs, small loans, and the kind of practical advice that could mean the difference between survival and success. Community leaders turned to her for counsel, and young girls sought her guidance as someone who had walked the path from poverty to independence. Eliza never married. Suitors came and went, widowers, professionals, men who admired her accomplishments, but she never accepted. The independence she had fought for was too precious, too hard won, to risk in a partnership that might demand vulnerability she could not afford. Marriage required a level of trust she had long since learned to guard against. Instead, she gave her care and mentorship to others, the young women who worked in her shop. The runaways who slipped quietly into the city, and the free-born girls who needed guidance to carve out their own space in a society still lined with barriers. By the end of the century, Eliza could look back with a kind of awe at the distance she had traveled from a slave girl born into suffering on a Mississippi plantation to a respected woman of means in Wisconsin. The journey seemed impossible when measured against the life she had once known. But she understood it clearly. Every step, every choice had been earned. The Icehouse remained far away, abandoned, but never forgotten. Its memory was etched into her understanding of the world. She knew that survival sometimes demanded choices. Society would condemn that freedom often required moral compromises forged in desperation. On that night in 1841, she had chosen her own life over the lives of her oppressors. It was not a choice she ever celebrated, but neither did she regret it. The lesson of the Icehouse, the knowledge that courage and self-determination could transform even the most brutal beginnings, became the cornerstone of her life. And as the century closed, Elizabeth Washington, once Eliza Monroe, stood not as a fugitive, but as a woman who had turned survival into triumph. In 1900, at 76, Eliza Washington, once Eliza Monroe, stood among the leaders of Milwaukee's Black community at a grand celebration, welcoming the new century. The room glowed with the achievements of men and women who had risen from slavery or fought against its shadow to become business owners, professionals, and community leaders. Eliza looked around with quiet pride, knowing her generation had carried the weight of bondage into freedom and laid the foundation for those who came after. To the younger people present, she was simply the dignified seamstress who owned property, gave generously to schools and churches, and offered counsel when asked. They respected her success, but could not fathom the storms she had endured, or the terrible choices that had shaped her life. That night, returning to her comfortable home, Eliza thought about the secret she had kept for nearly 60 years. She had never told the truth of the Bellamy plantation, of the frozen tomb where she had turned cruelty back on her oppressors. To reveal it would have been dangerous even decades later. Some would never see her as anything but a murderer. Yet she also wondered if a day would come when people would understand that slavery was so brutal, so crushing, that survival sometimes required brutal answers. The Bellamys had not been innocent. They had been shaped by a system that taught them to treat human lives as property, and their fate had been written in the cruelty they themselves wielded. Rumors of that night in 1841 never fully disappeared. Southern papers occasionally resurrected the mystery of the Bellamy's deaths, spinning tales about the missing slave girl. Some insisted she was a killer who had plotted her master's end. Others suggested she had simply fled in the chaos of an accident. The truth Eliza knew lived in the uneasy space between. She lived another 15 years, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1915 at the age of 91. Her estate, modest but carefully managed, was left to the schools and churches of Milwaukee's black community. Among her papers was a sealed envelope marked to be opened only after her death. Inside was the account she had written of her escape, her years in bondage, and the night she had claimed her freedom inside the Icehouse. The document remained hidden for decades until researchers studying the Underground Railroad discovered it in the mid-20th century. When its contents were revealed, they sparked fierce debate. Some historians condemned her for violence, while others defended her as a woman who seized the only path open to her. Activists argued over whether her actions diminished or strengthened the moral power of the freedom struggle. Those who truly understood the world of slavery saw it clearly. Eliza had chosen life, and her story revealed the impossible choices slavery forced upon its victims. Meanwhile, the legend of the Ice Witch of Natchez grew in Mississippi. Locals whispered that the Icehouse was haunted, that the Bellamy's spirits still lingered, or that the ghost of the girl who defied them stood watch. With each retelling, the story shifted. Sometimes she was a vengeful spirit, sometimes a cunning mortal who turned her master's cruelty against him. The abandoned plantation eventually vanished beneath forest and vines. But the Icehouse endured its thick stone walls, defying time. It stood alone as a monument to a winter's night. When power changed hands, when a young woman refused the fate others had written for her and claimed instead the terrifying, costly gift of her own freedom. Visitors who stumbled upon the ruins of the Bellamy plantation often spoke of the Icehouse with unease. Some claimed the air around it carried an unnatural chill, cold enough to raise goose flesh even under the summer sun. Whether it was truly haunted or simply a place heavy with memory, the sensation kept Eliza's story alive in the imagination of Mississippi locals, binding history and legend together. In the written account she left behind, Eliza spoke plainly about her choices. She voiced no regret for turning the Bellamy's punishment back upon them, for she knew the alternative would have been a life of bondage and a death without dignity. They had intended the Icehouse as her tomb. She had merely shown that a weapon could wound its wielder. To Eliza, her legacy was not the violence of that night, but the life she carved out of the freedom it secured. She had taken herself from property to person, from victim to survivor, and finally to a woman of independence and respect. Her story stood not only for her own triumph, but also for the countless others, named and unnamed, who found ways to resist slavery and claim freedom with whatever tools they had. Her methods were harsh, but her cause was righteous, and the life she built testified to the power of human determination against overwhelming odds. In later years, historians and activists argued about the morality of her actions. Some condemned the violence, insisting it stained her story. Others countered that slavery itself was a system steeped in violence so profound that any escape from it, however bloody, was an act of justice. The debate became part of a larger question, whether survival and freedom can always align with moral purity, or whether oppression sometimes forces people into choices that defy easy judgment. What no one could deny was Eliza's courage. She had looked directly into the face of a system designed to crush her, and she had fought back with the only weapons available. She transformed herself into Elizabeth Washington, a free woman, a business owner, a mentor, and an example for future generations. The legend of the Ice Witch of Natchez lingered in ghost stories, but the truth was more powerful than folklore. She was not a phantom, but a woman who seized her own destiny and lived on to nurture the freedom of others. Her life was proof of a hard-earned truth. Freedom is never simply given, it must be claimed, defended, and sometimes paid for at a terrible price. On that frozen night in 1841, Eliza Monroe chose life over death, freedom over bondage, and self-determination over submission. In doing so, she joined the ranks of those who refused to bow to cruelty, whose courage demonstrated that the human spirit, no matter how deeply caged, can never be fully broken. By the mid-20th century, the Ice Witch of Natchez had become more than a whisper of folklore. She was a living symbol of resistance. What had once been a local legend now carried national meaning. Eliza's story resurfaced at a time when the American South was once again in upheaval, this time under the pressure of the civil rights movement. Her written account, uncovered in 1955, emerged into public view. Just as Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, igniting a protest that showed the power of collective defiance. For activists, Eliza's journey was proof that the fight for freedom stretched back generations, that the struggle had always been waged by ordinary people who dared to act in extraordinary ways. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. even cited her story from the pulpit of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, describing her as someone who refused to accept the fate society prescribed. He acknowledged the extremity of her methods, but reminded his congregation that such actions were born from a system that left no peaceful avenues of escape. For King, she was a parable of determination, evidence that courage, even under crushing oppression, could carve out space for freedom. Yet her story also provoked debate. Some within the movement worried that celebrating a woman who had taken lives might blur the line between justified resistance and the commitment to nonviolence they held as a moral core. Others argued that Eliza's circumstances could not be judged by the standards of the 20th century. Enslaved people had no courts to petition, no legislatures to appeal to, no newspapers that would tell their truth. Her choice had been survival itself, and survival was never a crime. Scholars joined the discussion, placing Eliza's defiance within the larger pattern of enslaved resistance. They noted that enslaved men and women often weaponized their intimate knowledge of plantation life, sabotaging tools, feigning illness, or slipping away in the night. Few, however, had turned the very instruments of oppression so decisively back against their masters. Feminist historians emphasized another dimension: Eliza's refusal to submit to Harrison Bellamy's threats of sexual violence. For enslaved women, such dangers were constant, and resisting them demanded enormous bravery. Eliza's escape, they argued, was not only about freedom from slavery, but about reclaiming control over her own body. Her transformation from enslaved girl to business owner challenged the myths slavery had been built upon. Defenders of the institution claimed African Americans were incapable of managing money, navigating law, or running enterprises. Eliza disproved them all. She forged documents with precision, outmaneuvered legal systems designed to deny her existence, and built a dressmaking business that flourished for decades. To historians, she embodied the resourcefulness and intellect that slavery had sought to erase. Her story also illuminated the quiet, often overlooked helpers who aided freedom seekers. Mrs. Richter in St. Louis herself, an immigrant who had fled oppression, risked her livelihood to help Eliza slip away. The German family who carried her north through Illinois sheltered her not as a cause but as a fellow human being in need. Their choices revealed how ordinary people, moved by empathy or by their own experience of injustice, became unwitting actors in the broader drama of the Underground Railroad. As Eliza's story spread, it began to inspire art as well as history. A 1968 novel recast her life as a sweeping allegory of Black women's struggle for independence, weaving her choices into a larger tapestry of resilience. The book became a bestseller, carrying Eliza's name into households far removed from Mississippi or Wisconsin, and for many readers, it was their first encounter with her remarkable defiance. By then, the Ice Witch of Natchez had outgrown the legend of ghostly chills around an abandoned ruin. She had become something larger, a symbol that freedom is never given, only claimed. Her life and the myth that rose from it carried forward into each new struggle for justice, proof that even those born in bondage could rewrite their destiny with courage, cunning, and an unshakable will to survive. By the mid-1970s, Eliza's story had become firmly embedded in both scholarship and popular culture. A 1975 documentary film brought her tale to a wide audience, blending archival photographs, dramatic reenactments, and commentary from historians who framed her escape within the broader tradition of enslaved resistance in the antebellum South. The film won critical acclaim and awards, cementing Eliza Monroe Elizabeth Washington as not just a regional legend, but an essential part of African American historical memory. Artists and musicians followed suit. Folk singers, blues musicians, and later jazz performers wrote ballads and blues numbers that honored her defiance, while acknowledging the grim costs of her choice. Their lyrics dwelled on themes of survival, transformation, and the thin line between justice and vengeance. In their voices, the Ice Witch of Natchez became more than a figure of folklore. She became a testament to endurance, a symbol of the strength that carried a people through centuries of oppression. Meanwhile, the ruins of the Bellamy plantation became an unlikely tourist attraction. Visitors from across the country came to see the Icehouse, where a young enslaved woman had turned her master's cruelty against him. Guided tours combined her story with broader lessons about slavery in Mississippi, drawing both fascination and discomfort. Not all locals welcomed the attention. Some descendants of plantation families bristled at what they saw as the glorification of violence against their ancestors. Others, however, argued that telling the story honestly was necessary for reconciliation, that acknowledging the brutality of slavery was the only way to move forward. The Mississippi Historical Society eventually placed a state marker at the site, though the wording took years of negotiation. Historians, community leaders, and descendants debated each phrase, struggling to balance acknowledgement of Eliza's actions with recognition of the system that had forced her into them. The final text presented her as both a product of her time and a symbol of resistance, situating her within the long continuum of the fight for freedom. Archaeologists began studying the site in detail. Excavations of the former slave quarters uncovered hidden spaces where enslaved people had concealed precious belongings or practiced forbidden traditions, offering physical proof of the resistance networks long suspected to exist on plantations. The Icehouse itself became the focus of forensic investigation. Experts examined the structure's stonework, ventilation, and lock system, confirming that Eliza's written description matched its design precisely. It could indeed function as a prison, once sealed from outside, and the sub-freezing temperatures inside would have been lethal. Weather records from February 1841 added another layer of validation. They showed that the blizzard Eliza described was one of the most severe in Mississippi's recorded history, with brutal cold and high winds that would have made the night especially deadly. Modern medical reviews went further still. Doctors concluded that hypothermia would have claimed the children within hours, while the adults, larger and hardier, would have remained conscious longer, suffering the full agony of cold and panic before succumbing. These scientific findings removed any lingering doubt about the truth of Eliza's account. They confirmed that her decision to lock the Bellamys inside had directly caused their deaths. For historians, this evidence intensified debates about morality and necessity. Some argued it was calculated revenge. Others saw it as a desperate act of self-preservation. What was undeniable was that Eliza's improvised choice had been chillingly effective. In the Icehouse, she had rewritten the balance of power between master and slave, and in doing so created a story that would echo for generations. Legal scholars examining Eliza's case have pointed out that had she been captured and returned to Mississippi, she almost certainly would have faced charges of murder. 19th century laws offered no recognition of self-defense for enslaved people, even in the face of extreme abuse. The deaths of white children would have been treated not as the tragic consequences of cruelty, but as unforgivable crimes. The courts of Mississippi, steeped in the racial hierarchies of the time, would have made no allowance for Eliza's circumstances. Her escape was therefore not only a bid for freedom, but also an escape from certain execution. This harsh legal reality underscores the impossible bind enslaved people lived under. Stripped of any legal protections against violence, yet held fully accountable for any resistance. Eliza's decision highlights how the law itself was a weapon used to enforce submission, making rebellion both a moral and mortal risk. Modern discussions of Eliza's story often connected to contemporary struggles for justice. Activists and scholars see in her case a template for examining how oppressed people sometimes resort to extreme measures, and how society's judgment of those actions depends on whether it deems the systems being resisted legitimate. For educators, her story provides a way to engage students with complex questions about law versus morality, civil disobedience, and the circumstances that drive desperate choices. Her life also provides a case study in trauma and resilience. Psychologists note that Eliza exhibited natural responses to extreme abuse nightmares, emotional barriers, and a guarded independence. Yet she also demonstrated extraordinary resilience, building a thriving business, mentoring younger women, and contributing to her community. Social workers and mental health professionals use her story to show that trauma, while life-shaping, does not need to define a person's future. Eliza's ability to reframe herself from victim to survivor to leader illustrates both the lasting weight of trauma and the human capacity for healing. Historians of migration and urban development find significance in the geography of Eliza's journey. Her move from Mississippi to Wisconsin reflected a broader pattern that would accelerate decades later during the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans left the South in search of opportunity. Milwaukee became a crucial destination, a city where freedom seekers and later migrants built churches, schools, and businesses. Eliza's presence there and her eventual success helped lay groundwork for the networks that would support future generations. Economically, her dressmaking shop stood as a cornerstone of Milwaukee's black commercial district. Like many small businesses of the era, it served both black and white customers, helping to anchor a budding African-American middle class. Business educators today highlight her entrepreneurial adaptability, transforming skills learned in bondage into a flourishing enterprise. Her resourcefulness, risk-taking, and reinvestment in community made her a model of sustainable entrepreneurship. Economic historians have even estimated that at its peak, her shop's revenues would translate to several $100,000 in today's currency, making her one of the wealthiest black women in 19th century Wisconsin. This success directly challenged the racist mythologies of her time, demonstrating what African Americans could achieve when freed from the shackles of enforced dependency. Taken together, Eliza's story is not only one of survival and resistance, but also of remarkable innovation, resilience, and leadership. The Ice Witch of Natchez became not just a legend of vengeance, but a real woman whose life reshaped communities, economies, and historical memory. Religious scholars have long been drawn to the spiritual undercurrents in Eliza's life. Her steady involvement in the Methodist Church after settling in Milwaukee reflected a broader trend among formerly enslaved people, for whom the church provided not only spiritual guidance, but also a foundation for community mutual aid and political organization. Theologians examining her choices have grappled with weighty moral questions. Was her act one of justified self-defense? Could it be seen through the lens of just war theory? Or was it a tragic but necessary rupture with ideals of moral purity? These discussions often return to the deep tension between survival and righteousness that oppressed people have faced across history. Writers and critics, meanwhile, have embraced Eliza's tale for its literary richness. Her story blends the suspense of a thriller, the endurance of an adventure, and the sharp edge of social commentary. This has inspired novels, plays, and even poems that reinterpret her life, often focusing on themes of transformation, reinvention, and moral complexity. Creative authors see in Eliza's arc, from enslaved child to free woman from property to respected entrepreneur, a narrative blueprint for understanding how people can reshape their identities when circumstances demand it. The international scope of her escape has also drawn comparative attention. Eliza considered Canada as a possible destination, linking her directly to the larger network of the Underground Railroad and to global ideas of freedom that transcended national borders. Historians have compared her story with resistance movements in the Caribbean, South America, and Africa, finding common strategies using knowledge of local systems, seizing moments of vulnerability, forging new identities, while also noting the unique brutality of the American slave system. In these comparisons, Eliza stands as both an individual figure and part of a worldwide struggle for human liberation. Her technical ingenuity has fascinated another set of scholars. By forging documents, altering records, and leveraging her literacy, Eliza demonstrated an advanced understanding of how bureaucracies worked in the 19th century. She grasped that freedom in part could be written into existence on paper, if one knew how to mimic the authority of official forms. Modern information and identity scholars see her as an early example of someone hacking the system, turning tools of control into instruments of liberation. Today, digital historians have reconstructed her path with interactive maps, steamboat schedules, and archival documents, helping audiences experience the logistical brilliance required for such an escape. Efforts to preserve the physical remnants of her story have also sparked passionate debates. The Bellamy Plantation's Icehouse, still standing, has been at the center of historical preservation campaigns. Some see it as a vital memorial to resistance, while others bristle at what they view as the glorification of violence. Museums and exhibitions that tell Eliza's story often combine artifacts, immersive displays, and first-hand accounts to draw visitors into the stark choices she faced. In these spaces, the Icehouse becomes more than stone and wood. It becomes a lens for understanding the brutal mechanics of slavery and the daring required to defy it. Finally, behavioral scientists have approached Eliza as a case study in resilience under extreme duress. Her ability to endure years of cruelty, to carefully plan her escape, and to act decisively in the Icehouse suggests unusual psychological strength. Researchers note how her childhood, marked by loss and trauma, may have fostered both detachment and clarity in moments of crisis. Rather than being paralyzed by fear, she moved with precision. Her later life in Milwaukee, defined by business success, mentorship, and community building, shows the other side of that resilience, the capacity to transform trauma into purpose. Taken together, the religious, literary, international, technological, and psychological dimensions of Eliza Munro's story reveal why it continues to resonate. She was not merely a legend or the Ice Witch of Natchez, but a woman whose defiance bridged history, morality, and myth, forcing each new generation to wrestle with the cost of freedom and the courage required to claim it. Eliza's life has become a case study, not only in history, but in resilience and leadership. Scholars and educators note that her early adversity, though brutal, cultivated the clarity, adaptability, and courage she later drew upon in moments of crisis. The same qualities that allowed her to plan and execute her escape also carried into her years in Milwaukee, where she built a thriving business, mentored younger women, and invested in her community. Management educators and organizational specialists often point to her as an early example of leadership forged under pressure, someone who turned personal survival into collective empowerment. Social network analysts, too, find her story instructive. Eliza's success was not solely her own doing. it was shaped by the relationships she forged along the way. From Sarah the plantation cook, who secretly taught her to read, to Mrs. Richter in St. Louis, who helped her disappear north, to the German family who sheltered her as they crossed into free territory, Eliza learned to build and sustain networks of trust. Her story highlights how social capital relationships, alliances, and trust can be as vital to survival and success as money or skill. The gendered dimensions of her life continue to attract attention. Enslaved women faced unique vulnerabilities, particularly the constant threat of sexual exploitation. Eliza's refusal to submit to Harrison Bellamy's advances was itself an act of resistance, one that risked terrible consequences, but asserted her autonomy. Later in Milwaukee, her economic independence and choice to remain unmarried challenged 19th century norms of womanhood. By living on her own terms, she modeled a path for women who sought fulfillment outside the confines of marriage and dependence, offering a counter-narrative to dominant assumptions about gender roles. Her story endures not only for its drama, but also for its layered themes: violence and justice, survival and morality, individual struggle and collective meaning. It inspires while also forcing readers to wrestle with hard truths: that freedom has never been free, that resistance sometimes comes at terrible cost, and that history is built not only by great figures, but also by ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. Today, Eliza Monroe, remembered both as Elizabeth Washington and as the Ice Witch of Natchez, is taught in classrooms across the United States. Her life humanizes the history of slavery and freedom, reminding students that behind every law, every institution were individuals, making choices under impossible conditions. She has become more than legend. She is a symbol of resistance, reinvention, and the refusal to let oppression write the final chapter of one's life. Her legacy is not the Icehouse alone, but the enduring lesson that even in humanity's darkest systems, the human spirit can rise, fight back, and transform itself into something unbreakable.